Right. All right. So I think we have to. I'm going beyond what you might call just post-Keynesian economics to say I think we really need to rebuild economics from the ground up, and I'm calling it political economy for the obvious reason that when you do it properly, you can't avoid politics in the classic sense of the word. But I'm starting fundamentally from the point of view of the monetary approach, which makes post-Keynesian economics quite different to any other school of economic thought. All the others, to some extent, start operating in fundamentally the vision of a barter economy. Of course, the neoclassicals being the classic instance of that. And you think about what's the dominant question for neoclassical economics. It's how does a system of independent barter markets reach equilibrium? That pretty much defines their intellectual task. Now, they've failed to answer the question. That hasn't stopped them considering that it's still the answer. So they still work in a barter world, and if you see them, they're still struggling. 1.5 centuries virtually after Volra wrote, they're still struggling to explain why money exists. Well, I got a major leg up in my own work on modelling the monetary economy from reading the work of the post-Keynesian school called the Circuitists, who are a European-based school, mainly in France and Italy, particularly Italy. And there's a wonderful, now unfortunately deceased personality called Augusto Graziani, who was by far the dominant personality who put this school together. And Graziani's approach was written up in a paper in 1989, which is now available online. So if you click on that link, and I'll give you all a copy of the slides later on today, but if you click on that link, you can download a copy of the paper. And the argument they had was that the capitalism is a system of monetary system of production. If you look at the subtitle of the general theory, it's the same sort of argument. And what Graziani said, well, let's actually consider what money is. Let's define it, first of all. So he said there are 3 conditions for money to exist. One is it has to be a token, because if you don't have a token, you're using a commodity. And all you're doing is having an extended version. Rather than N commodities, you've got N+1 commodities. Well, big deal. It's still a barter model. So he said it must be something that nobody. Commodity money is something anybody can make for themselves. If we use gold as a commodity, you can go to a gold mining area, and if you work hard enough, you can find yourself an ounce of gold. Okay, you can make it yourself. That's a commodity money. So it must be a non-commodity, meaning you can't produce it. Okay, it can't be manufactured. So it has to be a token. In that sense, it's worthless. Okay, the token can do nothing other than be money. You can't use it to build a house. Okay, it's not a hammer, it's not a nail, it's just simply a token. The second is that it has to be accepted as means of final payment, because if I wrote a note here and saying, I want your Macintosh computer, here's a note from me saying I owe you €1,000. If you accepted it, I've still got to deliver the €1,000. Okay? You might give the machine to me, but there's still a debt obligation between the two of us. So for money to be genuinely money, it must be a final payment. If I give you €1,000, you accept that and you give it back to me, and only if the euro collapses, it's your problem, not mine. I've bought your product off you. Okay? So it's final settlement in that sense. And thirdly, it can't... Yeah? Sorry? Yeah, it's fine. Interrupt any time. Yeah?
So does this mean that money is just cash money?
No. Money. It means money's a token, whether that's a computer token, a checkbook entry, whatever it is. It's simply a... It can be coins as well, okay? But it's something which has no intrinsic value.
Yeah, that is true. So that if I pay for his computer, if I buy his computer and I pay by writing him a promissory note...
That's not money.
That's not money because...
Yeah.
But if I write him a check on a recognized bank account...
That is money.
This is money.
That is money. That's the basic idea. And he said the third thing, it can't grant rights of seigniorage, meaning that the agents who create it can't create it for themselves indefinitely. Now, of course, banks do that sort of thing, okay? There is plenty of illegal activity by banks where they make use of that capacity to create money for their own benefit. But fundamentally, what Graziani is saying here is that when if the bank wants to the bank can make money, can create money, but to actually make a profit for itself, it has to generate a return out of its capacity to create that money. So a legitimately behaving bank doesn't create money for its own account. It creates money which is then used for people in transactions, and that then becomes money which they can profit out of because they charge interest on the money that they've created, effectively. So he said if you have a seller A and a buyer B accepting tokens issued by Bank C, what it's saying is Bank C can't just print those tokens for its own use. Okay. Now, of course, to some extent that does happen. Okay. We're talking in an idealised sense of how an idealised bank should offer. But the basic idea is if the bank behaved that way all the time, it'd be like paying with IOUs. And of course, any bank that does that will ultimately fail because it can't deliver on the IOUs it's issued. So Graziani's I think it's brilliant, what I saw as truly brilliant insight was to say that the only way it can satisfy these conditions for money is to have payments made by means of promises of a third agent. So rather than, or if you think about the way that neoclassical theory gets us to think about transactions, we have two parties with two commodities and they want to swap them with each other. And the real, complex problem from that point of view is the double coincidence of wants. Well, this is quite different. This says there are three parties, one commodity and money. And it's a triangular vision of trade rather than the linear vision of trade that neoclassical theory has. So it says all transactions in a monetary economy are three-sided. There's a buyer who has the money and transfer it to the seller who has the product, and the bank records the transaction as a transfer of money from the buyer's account to the seller's account. Now that to me was an incredibly deep insight, so simple in many, many ways, but so deep at the same time. So banks become an essential element of capitalism. And Graziani, remembers writing in '89, this predates electronic banking. It's back in the days when the major transactions were done by checkbook. Okay? So when he's talking about paper money, what he's talking about is you having a checkbook, you write a note here saying, signed Steve Keane, I hand the cheque to you, it's on a legitimate bank, you're accepting that I've got enough money in my bank balance to do it, but when I transfer that sheet of paper to you, so long as I have that much money in my bank account, that transfer of a piece of paper means you give me a commodity in return. Okay? And that's the essential insight. And again, I'm doing a large number of quotes, so I'll go quickly during the quotes. You'll have the files to look at yourself later. But this gives you a bit of the background, the intellectual background. If I try to go through all my slides, we'd be here for 2 weeks. Okay? So that's why I'm going to go through fairly quickly. But then the minimum number of agents in a capitalist economy is 3, not 2. And that's a huge advance over the way the neoclassicals think. So you have seller A, who's got a commodity. Oh, that's great. I mean, decapitated. By the graphics here, that wasn't deliberate, but anyway, that's a newspaper seller, part of a newspaper seller. A buyer B, the graphics are really being stuffed up here. This is hilarious. Okay, I don't know what he's buying, but it doesn't look like a newspaper. Okay, and a bank C that records the transfer. That's the combination. They've all been completely screwed by changing the scale on my. You'll see it when you see the slides themselves. Now that's very different to the neoclassical buyer. A buyer seller A has commodity X wants Y, a buyer seller B has Y wants X. Okay, two commodities, two goods being exchanged, no bank involved. Now, that's a nice model of a barter economy, but it's not capitalism. Okay? So in a fundamental sense, neoclassical economics set itself the task of modelling a social system that doesn't exist. Really useful. Then they get the right to run the real world. So again, this has been, all the graphics are totally stuffed up in scale, but that's the A, B type vision that neoclassicals have. You're swapping apples for cameras. But from Graziani's point of view, a true monetary economy money is a non-commodity. Okay, it's a commodity in the sense you can trade with it, but it's not a commodity in the sense it can be manufactured by other commodities. The definition of a commodity, the strict commodity, is something you can make using other commodities. Okay? If you make money using other commodities, you are either a bank or a counterfeiter. Okay? Or a government. So you have this, I'm going to hammer the point a few times, so I won't go through this all that slyly, but that's the basic idea. You've got to have this idea of a bank in the middle doing transactions. Okay, so a buyer, a seller and a bank, and you can't treat banks as being other firms, which again is what neoclassical theory tends to do. They're essentially different. So banks and firms must be two distinct types of agents. Firms are producers and buyers and sellers of commodities. Banks are the means of payment, the clearing houses. And that's again a very essential difference. You must separate them into separate sectors. And when you think about it as well, when you talk in terms of social classes, your minimum number of social classes in a capitalist economy is now 3. It's not just workers and capitalists, it's workers, capitalists and bankers. Okay? So it's a 3-class vision as well as a 3-agent vision. Now this is all fantastic stuff, and it was really a revelation. There are very few books that I've read, or very few articles indeed, that have given a revelatory impact on my way of thinking. Schumpeter's theory of economic development was one. Minsky's Can It Happen Again? John Maynard Keynes was another, clearly. Marx, though I turned Marx upside down, and you'll see what I mean by that later on in the talk I'm giving here. Graziani is one of them. When I saw that, I understood how I could model a monetary economy. But what happened was, again, this tends to happen with post-Keynesians. They're taught economics by neoclassicals, and then they try to recover from the experience. Okay. But the trouble is, in recovering, they still tend to use the tools they were taught by the neoclassicals and what they think is mathematics. Now, what I describe what neoclassicals do as mythematics. Okay? If you actually did mathematics properly, it would have eliminated itself by proving its own foundations were wrong. It would have eliminated itself about 1920. Okay? That's when what's called the Perron-Frobenius theorem was developed by mathematicians, and that undermined the whole idea of a barter economy reaching equilibrium. It can't. Okay? Mathematically, the process doesn't work. That's been known now been known for almost a century. So if they'd actually been genuine mathematicians, they would have realised, oh dear, that our initial assumption was wrong. We can't get there. We've got to expand our vision, and on we would have gone to a realistic model, but they stuck with this fantasy model. But the trouble is, when post-Keynesians get an insight and then try to extend it, they're often using what they learned from neoclassical economists as mathematical tools or logical tools, and pardon the French, they fuck up. Okay? And Graziani fucks up from this point on. So he starts off, he divides firms in having a commercial sector, labour in the household sector, banks in a banking sector, and he talks about a central bank but doesn't actually include the central bank in the model. And then he has banks, first of all, gives firms the right to finance. So the first step is giving them credit to enable production, that's okay. He has the loans to enable them to hire workers. I've got a question mark there because, of course, banks do more than just hire workers with the money they get lent by the firms do more than just hire workers with the money they get lent. And also he said all other exchanges being internal transactions, no further monetary payment is required. Now that is implying that all the activities inside the firm sector are barter, which is garbage. Okay? If you want to do it properly, you've got to internalise the financial transactions of the firm sector. Okay, which again, some of these things are points where the level of logic hasn't gone on far enough. If you're going to have a monetary economy, everything is monetary. So when I do a large-scale multi-sectoral version of what I'll be showing you here today, I break my matrix of production in 2 halves and have sector A and sector B, firms in sector A and firms in sector B, in the same industry sector. Firm A buys off firm B and vice versa, because all transactions are fundamentally monetary. So even though it's true at a mathematical level, you collapse them inside the firm sector so they don't turn up in your data if you just have the firm sector and the household sector. Within the firm sector, all those transactions are monetary. Everything is monetary. But then he has hiring workers, and he then says they instantly pay all the borrowed money to workers as wages. Huh? Okay. No, I'm sorry. Workers deposit in bank accounts, workers are now the creditors, and then they've got a choice between savings and securities or keeping them in bank deposits. And then he says as long as money wages are not spent, the amount of money equal to the wage bill is in existence. They've got question marks all the way through here because this is just getting fairly crazy. The total amount of money is a debt of the firms to the banking sector and a credit of wage earners. So the vision he's got is the banks have lent money to the firms. The firms have then they're given all that money in one go to workers as wages. So firms have now got no money and all the money's with the workers. Okay. Can you see how he's starting to fall over himself in logic here? And then he says workers either spend or buy corporate bonds, yada, yada, yada. This destroys the money. Now, I must admit this is something I didn't accept initially, that payment of money, repayment of debt destroys money. It does. I'll show why later. But I didn't understand that first off. I put that down as one of the things I rejected. I've since realised I was wrong on that point. But he then says, how do they make a profit? Well, if the workers spend all their wages, firms get back what they paid and they don't make a loss. But effectively he's saying if they keep any of their, workers keep any of their wages as savings, firms get back less than they've paid and therefore they've made a loss. So I'm reading, initially this really brilliant insight, and then as I see the attempt to extend it gets crazier and crazier. So he's got workers have to spend all their wages so that firms can repay their debt. Then what about interest? Okay. They mention paying interest. And then he says at the end of the cycle, money initially created will not be totally destroyed. Part will still be a debt of firms to the banks. The money stock will be equal to the wage bill plus new deposits from the previous one. He says if workers spend all their wages, then money is completely destroyed. So if money is to persist, and this is the part I found quite this was the point of seeing that neoclassical thinking is still in Graziani's brain, even though he's made this huge leap logically from what the neoclassicals believed. An assumption is therefore required for the existence of a money stock, namely that wage earners spend their money incomes gradually over time. Yeah, of course they do. This may well seem an assumption of irrational behaviour. What? If no uncertainty is present. In other words, he's still thinking in a neoclassical way. He hasn't quite escaped the neoclassical cocoon. And this is a common problem for people who become non-orthodox in their thinking. They're still carrying over vestiges and they're not aware of it when they write. So this is a classic here. It's a necessary assumption. It's bloody reality. You only get paid. You don't spend your wage the instant you get it. You've got to survive for 2 weeks or a month. You spend it gradually. Over the end of the month, you might be out of money. But nothing irrational about it. It's acknowledging the existence of time, which, of course, is absent from neoclassical thinking in a fundamental way. So when you bring it in, you've got to think in terms of time. And on he goes. It's, all this sort of stuff. And I thought, this is just crazy. So capitalists can't borrow money and make a profit. Well, how come we're living in a real world with clearly positive profits and positive investment? If profit was zero, then investment would be negative and we'd be going backwards towards the Stone Age. I haven't noticed that recently. It may happen in the future, but it's not the real world. And spending income over time is irrational. Of course it's rational. So you find like Bellafiore, who's a good friend and a good researcher, has things like, for the sake of simplicity, we exclude the payment of interest to the banks. I'm sorry, you cannot exclude for simplicity something which is absolutely essential to the existence of the entity you're talking about. Okay? So there are these various failures which are not as bad as the neoclassicals. At least they admit these failures. Okay? Neoclassicals will jump over magical assumptions all the time. Profits are gained in real terms. It is impossible for firms to obtain monetary profits, etc., etc. If you add up the sum of all the profits of all the corporations in America or the globe, you will get a positive sum. So the theory we have has to be consistent with the real world. And this is a failure to get there. And it's not because of the circuitous logic being poor. They're still stuck in a neoclassical way of thinking. They still haven't completely escaped that mindset. And Louis-Philippe Richon, who established the Journal of the Review of Keynesian Economics, which I highly recommend any of you, if you can, subscribe, or get your library to subscribe to that journal, probably the most progressive developer of post-Keynesian Keynesian thought in general available now. And he said, how does M become M plus? And Marx's old classic, how do we go from money to more money? Something wasn't solved by the circuitous on their own. Well, it comes from a failure to think in a truly dynamic sense about finance. And actually, when you look at Keynes properly, Keynes had it right. So this is a paper, one of 3 papers Keynes wrote in 1937 after the publication of the general theory. And in many ways, I don't like the general theory. I've read it, obviously. I've taken some insights out of it, clearly. But it's a book which is a mishmash of Marshallian thought and what he was, the new ideas he had. And if you read one of the prefaces, I think it's a preface to the French edition, he is saying he's trying to integrate, the reason that banks have dropped out of his analysis, well, banks were in the treatise on money, but banks disappear from the general theory. And the reason is he thought he found a way of bringing banks into the Marshallian supply and demand framework. Okay, so he thought he integrated it with supply and demand thinking. I think that's the major mistake he made in the general theory. Now, in 1937, when he was responding to all the critiques of the general theory by his neoclassical opponents, then you got a very, very clear statement of his thoughts. So I regard the three papers, the general theory of employment, full stop, which is the main paper he wrote in 1937, alternative theories of the rate of interest, and a third paper's name I've forgotten, as a better guide to what's original in Keynes's thought than the general theory itself. Okay. So the general theory, chapter 12, I think is vital. Some of the back elements on trade policy as well are also quite vital, but those 37 papers are much, much better for getting a clear vision of what was new about Keynes. And in this paper, in the alternative theories of the rate of interest, he began to see something he'd left out of his ideas about demand for money that he should have included in the general theory. He says planned investment may have to secure its financial provision before the investment takes place. In other words, you've got to borrow the money before you can actually do the investment. He says that can be provided by new issuers, by issuing shares, or by the banks. It makes a difference to the firm, makes a big difference to the economy, as I'll show you shortly. But he then said, in the general theory, you had transactions demand for money, speculative demand for money, and precautionary demand. But he realised he's left out a fourth crucial demand, what he called the finance demand. Okay? But it's called this advance, the finance required for current decisions to invest. He said it's only a special case. But he said because it's subject to special fluctuations of its own, I now think, have done well to emphasise this when I analysed the various sources of the demand for money. So he realised that the general theory is incomplete. And of course, he never rewrote the general theory. It first of all involved in the world war effort, then he had a heart attack and he died. Okay, so this is what we have to do, is include that finance demand for money. And then he said the finance determines the investment, that the investment in turn determines what happens in terms of savings. So it's to an important extent the financial facilities that regulate new investment. And he said, again, go back now to Graziani talking about the loan disappearing. He said, well, a loan can continue indefinitely. The finance required can be supplied from a revolving fund of more or less a constant amount. So a certain amount of money is lent out, firms that borrow that money repay it over time, other firms borrow again, it continues circulating. And said only if you have a rising amount of investment, we need a rising amount of money. If there's a constant level of economic activity, that same amount of money will continue turning over. And what Keynes is showing is that circuitous have confused stock, which is the initial loan, with the flow, which is the spending that loan can finance over time. So if you borrow $100, that doesn't mean you can only spend $100. If you're in an economy of financial circulation, that $100 can be spent, can earn income back for you, and you can spend it again, etc., etc. And a $100 loan may enable a firm to generate $400 of turnovers per year, while continuing to have the $100 outstanding. So it's the idea of the turnover of money, effectively a velocity of money concept. So you go from the stock, which is the money, to the flow, which is the turnover, by considering what is the rate at which money turns over in the economy. Milton Friedman's, well, he's identified with the concept of the velocity of money, so the basic concept of the velocity and turnover of money. And here is Keynes saying there's a confusion between credit in the sense of finance and credit in the sense of bank loans. And he says the confusion between the first and the second is between the flow and the stock. Credit is the turnover of the money. I've used a different definition, but this is how Keynes is defining it. Credit in the sense of bank loans is the actual initial money. So the turnover of money is dollars per year. The debt money itself is dollars. They're denominated in different units, dollars and dollars per unit of time. And getting that clear in your mind is essential. So he said credit in the sense of finance looks after a flow. It's a revolving fund. The same finance can tackle one investment after another. So rather than, as Graziani said, the money being destroyed when it's repaid, it circulates between the bank accounts of the workers and the firms. Okay? And that circulation can enable a larger turnover. The amount of money created can turn over several times in 1 year. It's not destroyed when the workers pay it back to the firms again. That's the error, in logical error, that Graziani fell into. So, and Keynes again is clearly thinking of endogenous money here. The fact that the banks create the money by lending, that's clearly in Keynes' thought at this stage. If the banking system chooses to make the finance available. So it's not a case of having to bring in the savings and lend them out again, which is the loanable funds vision. It's being able to create the money by creating a loan. And he said the lovely line, the control of finance is indeed a potent, though sometimes dangerous, method for regulating the rate of investment. They're much more potent when used as a curb than as a stimulus. Now, that one sentence contains the essence of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. The argument credit can extend demand during a boom, and when it's cut off, it can cause a slump. Okay, so you find all this stuff very deeply in Keynes. This is only another way of expressing the power of the banks through their control over the supply of money, liquidity. Now, so what was lost in the general theory from the treatise of money is now turning up in the 37 papers, and much, much better integrated. So I highly recommend all of you to read those. Very short, they're only about 15 pages, each of them. Very worthwhile things. Okay, you've now got Minsky, and Minsky evolved out of my appreciation of Graziani's insights into the role of banks in the creation of money, and also Keynes's observations on finance, and then Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And I have a training in complex systems mathematics and a background in computing. I spent 15 years, I think, as the software editor for 2 major Australian computing magazines. So I got to see virtually any software I wanted to see. I could simply say, please send me a copy of that software. And within 4 hours, there was a truck at my door with the manuals and the software and so on. I once had a very funny experience of having a hacker, a fairly famous Australian hacker, turn up at my house back in this is in the mid-90s. And I had 2 rooms in the house. I was in a share house, and I had 2 rooms, one a bedroom. The other was a little narrow room about as long as this one, but about 1/3 as wide, which I just had for my software collection. And this guy walked inside. He's a typical hacker, but weighed about 150 kilos, bearded, long hair, the whole thing. And he stands like this, looking up the row of software, just like this in shock. And I, being smug, I said, I did a humble brag. I said, what's the matter? Haven't you seen that much software before? And he said, no, I just haven't seen that much legal software before. So I had Oracle, every computer programming. I had 65 databases, give you an idea, 20 or so spreadsheet packages, 15 integrated software packages, roughly speaking. They've all gone in the garbage bin over years, but that's what I had. So out of that background, I had ideas about how one can design a software package like Minsky. Now, with the approach that it's built on is called system dynamics, and that was pioneered by Jay Forrester. I'll talk more about him later in the course here. And there's a whole range of computer programs, which I first bought one of these programs in 1993. Okay? So they've been around for an enormous length of time. They actually date back to the late 50s. The very first software package was called Simple. Simulation of processes using lots of equations. That's the name Simple came from. Simulation of processes using lots of equations. Simple. Then there was Dynamo. They were the very first 2. Finally, you got one called Stellar, and that became what's called VenSim. Most engineers use one called Simulink. It's embodied in MATLAB. So this is stuff engineers have known about for 30, 40 years, and they're stunned that economists don't even know this stuff exists. But most economists have no idea this software exists. So what I've added to that basic idea is the capacity to build models of monetary flows using double-entry bookkeeping. And that's what I want to take you through now. So if you look back at the history of where double-entry bookkeeping came from, I've seen arguments just recently that there are records in Sumerian accounts that are effectively double-entry bookkeeping. Okay. Recent argument, Michael Hudson's written a new dictionary entry for, I think it's Springer Verlag. I'm not sure, I've forgotten, in fact, but I know Michael's written this entry. And he said if you look at some of the cuneiforms, it appears that it was double entry. It was understood back in Sumerian times, but it became very dominant in the 1500s. as a way of merchants keeping track of their transactions. And the essential idea was to keep a record by having 2 records of every transaction on one line in a ledger, where you classify the transaction as either an asset or a liability or an equity entry. And the basic logic is that it's effectively you record it once as a positive and once as a negative, so across the row it sums to 0. Okay? And so long as your row sums to 0, you know you've done the accounting properly. So there are 3 types of accounts. There's assets, which are a positive. If you're, from your point of view, if you're looking at a particular entity, its assets are a positive for it. Then there's the liabilities, which are a negative for the entity, and the equity, which is the net worth. If you subtract the liabilities from the assets that a particular entity has, you get their equity, or their capital, as it'll be called by accountants on occasions. So the fundamental law of accounting is assets minus liabilities equals equity. And if I use simples, A minus L equals E, which means that A minus L minus E equals 0. Okay?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
In this double entry bookkeeping, are we trying to keep track of flows, or are these stocks?
Yes.
So
Both. Both turn up there. The stocks, the actual transactions are flows.
Yeah.
Okay. But the flows themselves change the value of stocks. So each row is a flow. Okay. But the flow then changes the value of the stock. So what I'm doing in Minsky, what accountants are effectively doing is a sort of set of difference equations, because each transaction will change the value of the stock. There'll be a flow worth a certain amount, which might say $20, and that might increase an asset by 20, and it will be shown as increasing a liability by 20 or increasing equity by 20 as well. So that's, as well as being a flow, it's a change in a stock. So they're integrated in that sense. And what I do with Minsky is I force that by the columns themselves are telling you the rates of change of the stocks, and the entries and the flows are the rates of change as well. Yeah, but that's a good point. So being slightly facetious in my answer. Okay. So the convention that accountants use are to label things as debitors and credits, DR and CR. Now I find that confusing, and there's a lot of turns a lot of people off accounting, I think. But a good accountant knows how to classify things as debits or credits depending upon whether you're talking about assets or liabilities, whether they increment or decrement and so on. I find it a pain. You can do that with Minsky. If you're trained as an accountant, you can set up using options. I'll actually go across to Minsky now. You'll see under options, I'll just actually zoom in there. So you've got an options menu, and that includes preferences, and those preferences include whether you use debit or credit or plus and minus. And I don't know why both of them are highlighted, right? That's another bug. I think I found another bug there. Should be either or. Let's see if I can actually make it change. Yeah, okay. So now plus and minus will be used. And I just find plus and minus rather easier to use. Notice also you can turn on and off double entry. That's a sign of me learning the importance of double entry as I designed Minsky. I'll just leave it at that particular change. Let's go back and keep on going here. So the convention that I use in Minsky is to show assets as a positive, okay, and liabilities as a negative. Makes sense. Equities also as a negative. Now that doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive. Okay, but the idea is if you do that, if you add all the rows together, you must get 0. So it's a bit like what engineers do. Engineers define electrons as negative, but their circuit diagrams show the flow of current going from positive to negative. That's the opposite of the way they define the value of an electron. An electron, by the way, does not necessarily have a negative charge. We just call it negative. We could call it positive charge. It's our labelling, okay? But the labelling they've chosen is negative for the value of the electron. Electrons flow in electric circuits, and they flow from positive to negative. It's counterintuitive given how you've defined the electron, but it makes it easier to read the circuit diagrams. Same sort of thing applies here. So if you have A minus L minus E is equal to 0 when you treat them all as positive, then if you define assets as positive and liabilities and equity as negative, then summing a row gives you exactly the same outcome. A plus L plus E equals 0. Okay? So that's the basic idea. And Minsky checks that with every entry. So what we'll do to start doing that, if you click on the bank icon on the palette, and let's go across here and I'll show you that. Up here, you have a range of entries. You have the bank, variable, constant, integral block, plus, minus, multiply, divide, log, x to the power, less than or equal to, minimum, maximum, logical and, logical or, logical not, time, differential equation. I'll go through the whole lot. Data entry, reading in data from a separate data file, square root, exponential, natural logarithm, sine, cosine, tan, sinh, cosh, tan, the exponential versions are the same, modulus of x. I'm not sure what that one is. Looks like something wrong with the icon there. Tracing, which is for looking how the logical flow of a program. A switch, which is very important. We'll use switches later on. A graph, and then a comment. So if you want to create any of them, you simply click on one of them, click once and release, and then you get the icon attached to the mouse, and when you click again, it'll stay in place. So just put a bank icon on your screen there. You all done it? Got a bank there? Okay. Now if you whoops, this is my mouse has got a real painful feature. It scrolls the screen on which I don't want it to do. But okay, if you right click, one of the options is Open Godly Table, and Godly tables are called Godly in honour of Wynne Godly, who again I learned a huge amount from, actually directly in Wynne's case, because when I was writing Debunking Economics, Wynne was, I did a large part of the writing at the Levy Institute in Bard College, and Wynne was there as a scholar at the time, so we were sitting in neighbouring offices. I was actually in Hyman Minsky's office, and Godley was his own office right next door, so I learned a lot about double entry directly from Wynne. So what you get is this Godly table. Now, as I said, some things about this, if I don't know why that's been turned off, I better click it back on again. Make sure it shows double entry. Okay, if it shows single entry, click on double. Because when I first started doing this, I was doing it in another package called MathCAD, and I didn't realise the importance of double entry, so I had single entry rows were possible. I've since realised that double entry is essential, so we're going to get rid of that feature to be able to have single entry, but at the moment we're stuck with it as a legacy. And what you then have is, you'll see you have the flow, the V there says flow entries are made down the table as you add more rows, which you can do over here. Stock variables are entered across here, and you can add additional stock entries by clicking on the plus key. Now it starts by saying no asset class there. Now that's because initially we didn't have a division of things into assets, liabilities and equity in Minsky. We had to add it later. So again, one thing I want to do if I get more development funds for Minsky is make a strict set of tables where each table has assets, liabilities and equity hardwired into it. But at the moment, to make something into an asset, you've got to click on that little window and choose asset. So I come down here and I click on asset. That's now going to be an asset. And for example, I think I'll just for the heck of it, type in reserve. Now again, we're using a third-party spreadsheet here, by the way. It's not very good, but it was free for us to use. It just made it faster for us to develop the program. Again, the one thing I want to do is improve the spreadsheet element here, but I've now typed reserves in there as one asset. And if I click on the plus key, then I get an extra column. Okay? And you can add extra columns that way, and the same thing applies down here for rows. Now, let's just say we create loans as another asset of the banking sector. And then click on the plus key again. I'll just actually check and see where I'm getting to in my slides here. Okay. So we're going to have loans as an asset of the banking sector and deposits as liability and banking. So let's go over here. Actually, I'll get you to go slightly more advanced. In this thing, see the asset button there, click on asset and choose liability. Just show you what that looks like. So I've got an asset of reserves, an asset of loans, and I've got liability here. And I'm going to type firms as liability. Then click the plus key and now type workers. And click the plus key again. drag it sideways so you can see more clearly. Click and choose equity and just type bank. So you should have these 5 stocks: reserves and loans, which are both assets of the banking sector, and firms and workers and equity. Firms and workers are liability, that's going to be deposit accounts for the firms and the workers, and equity is what the bank's net worth is, which of course for a bank must have a positive net worth. Okay? If a bank has a negative net worth, it is bankrupt. So that must be a positive entry for the banks. Now, having done that, notice you've got initial conditions here. Let's say we make initial, I'm not going to put anything in reserves for now. Well, let's say there's initial loans of, say, 100. When you type 100 there and move sideways, you'll see Minsky will tell you the row sum is currently 100. Now, just like all flows have to sum to 0, all initial conditions have to sum to 0 as well. So we've got to type negative entries to bring that down to the stage where the total sum is negative. Now, let's say initially the bank, let's say the bank starts with its initial loan is of 10 to the firm sector. So it starts with 90 equity and there's 10 in the firm sector. And once you've done that, you've now got a row sum of 0. So you have 100 in the loans, minus 10, which is from the bank's point of view, that's a liability, and minus 90, again, that little trick to make sure the accounting is correct, so the equity is shown as a negative. That gives the bank a positive equity. Now, I'll just actually check and see what Minsky's doing here. Let's see. Nothing so far. Okay. We haven't actually created any flows yet. So I now, for example, click on the column here and say lend money. There's a flow. This is just a label, by the way. We don't actually make any use of this yet. We might later. The lend money is what you're doing. So we're going to have a positive entry. And I'm going to cheat a bit here. I'm going to call this L_F. Loans to the firm sector.
Can you show which button?
Pardon? Oh, there's the plus key here.
Yeah, it's a bit small.
Yeah, if you click on that plus key, that creates an additional row. And then you continue, you get another one here. You can create it and create and delete rows and also move rows up and down if you want to reorganise things. So I've typed LF as an entry there in loans. The row sum is now positive. It's got to be 0. So I need a negative symbolic entry of the same. And if I type minus L_F, then Minsky says, okay, the row sum is 0. Okay, can you do that? So L_F for a loan and put it a loan to the firm sector. That's why I'm using _F to indicate it's to the firm sector. Okay. Now let's see what Minsky is doing. Ah, still nothing. Okay. I'll move the bank icon a bit. Let's see if that actually triggers it. It hasn't triggered it yet. What Minsky's going to do is define differential equations for all these operations, but it hasn't quite got. Actually, I'll shut the window. I'll just shut it down. Ah, it's still not turning up. I hope this isn't a bug in the new version. Let's see. Still not turning up. Okay. Let's add a few more operations. What we have here, first of all. Okay. So I have loans to the firm sector. Let's now say they hire workers, which is the next stage that Graziani spoke about. So hire workers. Well, that's going to be paying wages from the firm sector to the bank to the workers. So you have wages as a positive entry. The reason for it being a positive entry is, to show you here, any amount of money paid as wages reduces the liability of the banking sector owes to the firm sector. So you show it as a positive there and a negative in the workers' account, which is going to increase the amount of money the workers have got, okay, from the workers' point of view.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand. So you are, because I don't see very well.
Yeah.
What do you have here? You have the balance sheet of one bank, or you have the balance sheet
of the banking sector?
Of the banking
sector.
Yeah,
but if I wanted to, I could make multiple banks here.
Okay, so
okay.
The banking sector, consolidated banking sector. And in part of the deposit, there are deposits of workers and deposits of firms.
That's right. And aggregating them.
And then the loans, okay.
Yeah, but Minsky can handle multiple banking icons, and I'll show you that in a moment. We're going to have about at least 3 sets here as well to show you the financial system from the point of view of the workers, the firms, and the banks all at once. So have you all got the wages entries shown there? Done okay? Okay, now let's then have paying interest. If you're going to pay interest, that is going to be a payment from the firm sector. So you put a positive entry, let's call it INT_F, and that's going to increase the equity of the banking sector. So I'll put minus INTF there as an entry in the equity of the banking sector.
So what was the thing you were writing in the
Pay
interest? INTF?
Yeah.
What does that come from?
Pardon?
The INTF?
The interest paid by the firms
Okay.
to the workers sector, to the banking sector. Of course, once you've got that, workers are going to consume. And this is the flow elements that Graziani didn't get right. So I'm going to show cons for consumption _W for workers. And I'll make a mistake here deliberately. If I don't give the right sign, if I type 2 positive entries there by mistake, Minsky tells me the sum is 2 times that when it should be 0. So it's doing error checking here. If that happens, you can click in the little box there and hold your control key down, and each time you press the control key, you move 1 character sideways. So now to the beginning there. And now if I type the minus, that now becomes a red entry and the row is correct. Okay. Now I can also have bankers consuming. They do more than consume, but this is just a simple illustration. They're going to buy stuff off the firm sector. And then finally, they're going to repay the debt. So I'm going to show repay _F here. And now that's going to reduce the amount of money in the loan. And this is where the signing now makes obvious sense. So repaying the loan reduces the amount of debt outstanding. Now, having done all that, let's take a look at so we have those are the operations. Lend money, hire workers, pay interest, workers consume, bankers consume, you repay the debt. You then have, those are the entries for the loans column, much more complicated for the firm sector. Those are the entries for the workers and for the bankers, and the sum of all rows is 0. So we're making sure we're stock flow consistent automatically. Stock flow consistent. Having done all that, Minsky should now, Russell, this might be a bug. It should be showing the equations. It's not doing it yet. So what I'm going to do is do the first part of defining a model. You notice that now that we've created all those entries, the banking icon down the bottom, it's got the assets, reserves, loans, firms, workers, and bank. And down the side, it's got the flow entries we've shown, loans to the firm sector, wages, interest paid by the firm sector, consumption by workers, consumption by bankers, and repayment by the firm sector. Okay? So they're all being created as icons. If you right-click on one of them, let's say the easiest one to define is going to be interest paid by the firms. That's going to be the interest rate times the level of debt. So if you right-click on that, you get a little menu showing edit and copy. Now, edit is a legacy. It's something we used to let you edit directly at that point. We don't anymore. Again, these are the sorts of things I want to get rid of from the program, but I've got to pay money to my developers to do that. So just ignore edit and choose copy. And click and drag, and you can place that somewhere else on the canvas there. My mouse is now in just pain in the arse mode, pardon me. So I want to move over here and choose copy loans, and I've now got loans and interest payment as two elements on the canvas, and it's still in painful mode. So I've now created loans and interest. So what are interest payments by firms? It's the rate of interest times loans, isn't it? Okay, so we now want to have a rate of interest here. So I just type R_L for rate of interest on loans and press the enter key. And Minsky will create a little icon. Notice the L is subscripted. So just type R_L and press the enter key, and you create a variable called rate of interest on loans. Now I'll put the cursor, you can see the cursor's in the middle between those three objects. If you press the multiply key on your keyboard, that creates a multiply key. Do that?
Sorry, how did you get the third one?
The RL, just type it on the canvas. Just click anywhere you like on the canvas and press R_L and press the enter key. Okay? Have you all got that on your canvas now? Now we want to make an equation here. So what I do is I want to have the rate of interest multiplied by loans is equal to interest paid by firms. So if you notice, I'll just click over here on the object itself, and notice that there are two little circles. The back circle's an input, so you can define the rate of interest using other entities in the system if you want to get complicated. Loans doesn't have that. Loans only has the output. The reason is you defined loans over here. Okay, so something you can't define. You've got to define loans inside the Godley table, so there's no input on the loans block, but there is an input on these. And notice there are inputs on the multiply key as well. If you click in the object away from the circle, you simply move its location on the screen. But if you click in the circle and drag, an arrow comes out, and you can attach the arrow to another input. And having done that, I've now defined an equation saying interest payments by firms are equal to the rate of interest times loans. Okay, now let's see what Minsky's done in the background here. Aha. Now we've got the equations turning up. So Minsky is now converting all this into differential equations. So first of all, you haven't defined consumption by bankers or workers yet. We haven't defined loans by firms either, or repayment. They're all zeros at the moment. We have defined interest on paid by firms is the rate of interest multiplied by loans. We've got the initial condition, bank's equity starts at 90. The change in bank equity is interest payments by firms minus consumption by banks. Firms deposit starts as 10. The rate of change of the firm's account is loans, new loans by the firm sector, plus consumption by workers and bankers, minus wages, interest payments and repayment. And you then have loans increased by LF, reduced by repayment, and workers' accounts rise because of wages and fall because of consumption. So you basically defined, very rapidly, a simple dynamic system. Okay? So what we're now doing is saying, looking at Graziani's logic now, let's actually work with it properly. Let's define these things properly. So far we've just defined interest payments. We have to define loans by firms, wages, consumption by workers, consumption by bankers, and repayment. Let's just at the simple level, let's for a while ignore loans by firms. We've got a certain amount of money in the economy already created. Okay, so I'm not going to look at loans or repayments. Well, let's just simply say, well, what are wages? Well, one possibility, actually I'll make this a bit larger. If you click on the plus key, you zoom in a bit, and if you hold the shift key down, you can drag the whole canvas around. So if you want to make things larger on your own screen, I'll make it a lot larger here. So that makes it easy to see what I'm working with. The scale of this canvas, by the way, is 100,000 pixels by 100,000 pixels. Now, we haven't got a computer monitor big enough for that yet, but the idea is ultimately we want to be able to make a wraparound model of an economy, like on a set of wraparound screens in a room 20 metres across, so you can see an entire model of an economy and control it that way. Okay, that's That's the intention behind the design, but that's again a lot of coding is necessary before that'll be possible. Let's now, the rate of interest on loans, we haven't defined that. If you right click and choose edit, I can give it a value, say 0.05. So 5% rate of interest on loans. So give that a try. So either right click or double click on RL, and you can then define it as say 5%. Now the loans are currently, if you look at what loans currently are, if you go inside the Godley table, see loans are currently 100. So your vision is an issue. Okay.
My hearing is an issue.
Yeah. There you go. Let's now define, oh no, this is my mouse being a pain in the butt. It'll do that occasionally, unfortunately. So I'm going to copy wages. I need to define wages now. Now the easiest way to define wages is to look at the firm sector, first of all, and say wages are paid by firms. Okay? So a certain number of times per year, the money in the firm sector will turn over paying wages. Let's say it happens 3 times per year, which is a fairly simple idea. So the firms have $100 of loans, they'll pay out $300 per year in wages. So if I just have, let's see, that's this stupid mouse interacting badly with Minsky. It's zoomed to a ridiculous scale. There's a scroll bar. Minsky uses a scroll bar. If you have a scroll bar on your mouse, then you can zoom in or zoom out by going up in the scroll. I'm doing that deliberately now, but I can't avoid triggering it on this mouse. It's really a pain. So that's what's going on. When you see it move like that's what's going on. So I'm going to multiply firms. So I'll call this T_W for turnover of wages. Now notice that's very small on screen compared to the other icons. This is a bug. We haven't had a chance to fix it yet, but the program should automatically rescale to whatever scale you're currently operating at. It doesn't, but if you move the object slightly, then it rescales. Okay? So if I multiply firms by TW, and again just click on drag where the circle is. It took us ages to get the circle the right size, by the way. Okay, now let's say this is 3. Just give it a value of 3. I'll make it more complex than this in a later model. This is just to get a very fast model up and running. So we've got wages defined that way. Now consumption by workers.
So for wages, you are saying it is a certain amount of turnover of the outstanding loan of the firms.
That's right.
So this implicit assumption that you are making that purchasing raw material takes also money.
Yeah, but it's inside the firm sector, so you don't see it here. Yeah, but if you expand it, like I have a consumption sector and an investment sector, then I have the consumption sector buying from the investment sector and vice versa. And if I wanted to be serious about a model, I'd break the consumption sector into C1 and C2 and have consumption by the firm sector, like buying, say buying light industry products. If you regard consumer goods as light industry, then I'd have C1 buys from C2 and C2 buys from C1. And then investment would have I1 and I2, and I1 would buy investment goods from I2 and vice versa. So you can force all transactions to be monetary that way. Otherwise they disappear inside a matrix.
But this financing that firms get from banks, they need money both to pay wages and also to pay inputs. Yeah,
you simply have to elaborate the model. So it hasn't been elaborated yet. Yeah, this is like
it doesn't change much.
No, it changes a bit. It does change the dynamics of the system, and we'll show that later. But I'll just get this to the stage where you can see it. Now, workers, of course, are going to consume depending on what's in there. I hate this mouse with Minsky, I really do. Oh, it just works so badly. It's a great little mouse for portability, but it's a pain in the butt when I'm trying to run Minsky. Look at that. I'm not doing any of that deliberately. Oh, that's where the red dot came from, I'm sure. Bloody hell, pardon me, hang on, I'll turn the bloody thing off and just use my... Oh, where the hell's it gone? That's all there. Come on, Minsky, bring it back to me. Great. I'm going to better save this. You can save at any time, by the way. Please save early and save often. Okay. So I'm going to call this Graziani 01. Now I'm going to load it again and hope that it works okay. Let's see, hang on. It's possibly been saved at 0 scale. I've just got to hope I can find it. Let's see. Great. Okay, I've got it back. And I'll make it larger, and I'll just use my my touchpad on the that works better. So I've got consumption by workers. Workers are going to consume depending on what's in their bank account. So take hold of consumption by workers. And I'm not going to explain why at the moment, but I'm going to give a large number for workers' consumption. So I'm going to have turnover so C underscore W by workers, and I'm going to give that a value of 20. And if I multiply one by the other, again I simply have to drag out of the circle. That's defined consumption by workers.
Sorry, so consumption is a function of the money they have?
Yeah, effectively. I'm saying they've got a buffer they spend out of.
As opposed to wanting to link it directly to the flow of wages they make year by year?
Yeah, you can do that as well. And I do that in some models. So I have wages...
Consumption a function of wages.
Yeah, you can do it either way. But again, it's just faster to do it this way. And C underscore B for the banks, and give a small number for that. And Minsky has a little trick. If you drag out from the circle and let go of the arrow, it tries to work out where the nearest attachment point is. So it'll go rapidly to the attachment point. Well, let's just do the same now for here. And I'll give a value for consumption by bankers of 1. Okay, and now save that model. So have you all got to that same stage on your models? I'll come take a look, hang on.
It stops working.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Oh, it stopped working. Okay.
Yeah.
Alt space bar. Hold down the space bar. Press the space bar and choose close. Okay?
So
do that. Now you'll find it's working again.
Oh.
Okay? So just Alt space bar. Now choose close. Alt space bar and close. Now it'll work again.
Okay.
Okay?
Just quickly, I did it like 3 times. Like this is my initial one, this one I want now.
Go back and click on it then. Yeah.
But it's not coming. Like this one we just did like. Okay, now I can work on this and then it's all right. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I was scratched, just I'll install it later because I don't know, it's like a virus, you know.
Oh no, it's just a, again, software has bugs.
I just recap with info Mac afterwards.
Yeah, okay. And unfortunately, to fix bugs takes computer programming time. Computer programming time costs money, and I haven't got money. So I'm trying to raise it with my Patreon campaign to keep this development going. Yeah. The software you're looking at has had about $250,000 spent on it.
Oh wow.
That's trivial. Okay?
Who's the code is actually initial this software?
Who wrote it? A guy called Russell Standish, who's was a professor of applied mathematics and computer science and
which language of coding?
C++, and also uses a graphical interface called TCL2K, which is a fairly old Linux GUI system. We're actually moving across to HTML5, but again, all this stuff takes money. I've got to raise $120 an hour for Russell's programming time. So so the total amount of money I've raised was enough to get about 2,500 hours of programming done, which is a bit over 1 year's work by one programmer, which is ridiculously trivial compared to all the packages you normally use. Word would have millions of hours of programming time in it, but that's just the hassle. It's very hard to get research funding for software development. Okay, so I'm hoping I can manage to do it.
Free of charge, this software?
Pardon?
Is it completely free of charge?
It's open source and free.
Okay.
Okay.
Are you plans just to make it just money in the future?
I may have to get funding enough to raise it, because you know, if I was charging $1 a copy, I might get a few $1,000s a year, or maybe more. But yeah, without development funds behind it, it'll stay at a primitive level. Well, let's try to use it now.
What are the values of the CW and CB?
Pardon? Oh, it gives value 20 or 30 to CW, and 1 or so to C.
So thank you.
Make it 20 or 30, yeah, that's okay. And say 1 for CB. Okay. Having done all that, notice the graph icon. See the plot icon there? Click on plot and drag, and you get ability to plot this out. And now it's just going to, for the interest, let's see what's the amount of money in the firms and in the firm sector. Right click, I can choose copy again. You can make as many copies as you like. So I want to see how much money is in the firm sector. How much money is in the workers sector? Can you use any of the icons to copy? I'll copy that one. And how much is in the bank sector? Right click and choose copy. And once you've got it set up, click stop and then run, and you can now see the money in the sector. And what's going on, to stop it and take a look, the firms have now got 82 of the $100 that were created, the workers have got 12, and the bank, I think, will have 5. Okay? So what we've got, money in the economy is turning over. This the model, the simulation runs in years. I'll just actually drag this over so you can see it more clearly. And we've been running that model. Let's move it around a bit. For 196 years. Okay. Now notice what's been happening. The amount of money starts off being in the equity account of the bank, and that plunges, but then settles at 5, which is the interest it's charging on the debt. Okay. The amount of money in the firm sector starts off very low, but rises up to about 80 or so, and about 15 or so belongs in the bank in the accounts of the working sector. So what you've got is, and I'll just stop it and run it more slowly. You can slow down the simulation speed using this slider. But you can see that process of the money shuffling itself between the accounts and continuing to turn over in the fashion that Keynes spoke about in that paper, rather than the money disappearing. The workers are spending the money gradually over time. The money is circulating between the bank accounts, and you're maintaining a constant amount of economic activity out of those actions. Okay? So all it takes is putting Graziani's insights into a sensible dynamic framework, and you can see that all the dilemmas he saw were not real. They were dilemmas of not knowing the mathematics of the dynamic systems. But his insights were correct. So you put those insights together, the firm sector can create money, can borrow money from the banks, that creates money. If there's only a certain amount of money in the economy, it turns over at the same level. You've got the amount of money in the accounts rising and falling. I'll actually keep on clicking on this silly mouse of mine, which I don't have. And what you've got is this dynamic system here, describing a very simple economy. Okay?
Steve?
Yeah.
Sorry. You know, I didn't understand. I don't know whether the others understood. I didn't understand.
Okay.
And I wish you could do it by writing a model, and first I'd like to understand what is our starting position,
Yeah.
and what is the first step. what happened the first step, and
Yeah.
then we can understand how these things start
Okay.
going over. But I am still not clear about what is the initial position.
Yep.
Like I'd like to see it again with like the balance sheet of the banking sector.
Yep.
In that balance sheet, we have the deposit of the firm, the deposits of the household, of the
Yep.
workers, and then we have the equity of the firm, and then we have the loans.
Yeah.
So these numbers, what are the starting values for
Yep.
these?
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened in the first round, and then
Yeah.
we can understand what happened in the second. Can you
Yep.
show us again?
Yep. Well, we might do that after a coffee break because it's 10:30 now. Like, is that a general feeling? Do you all need to see it more slowly than that? Because
And
I'm,
especially
But is it
with
possible-
numbers on the
yeah,
backward.
yeah.
Can I ask you something? Is it
Yeah.
possible to use some kind of special penalty